something fundamental has to change about the way we're governed. You have to put something in law that says these people cannot give our powers away. You're gonna basically take 650 narcissistic sociopaths, put them in one room, and give them unlimited power for 5 years to make decisions on our behalf. So the next 5 to 10 years is going to be a political and social and economic paralysis. There's fury. They have no idea how dangerous times are getting. They have no idea how big the problems are, and they have no idea how to fix any of it, and they've got no idea that all of their favorite solutions are going to massively exacerbate the problems and make everything worse. We need to be thinking in terms of not the next 5, but the next 10, possibly 15 and 20 years. There's a 20-year road back to power for what we actually want. These are facile, superficial, intellectual pygmies. That's the problem. I just don't see the right getting its act together.
Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Nick Dixon, and today we have another very interesting guest. You'll probably know him as Northern Variant on X, formerly Twitter. It is, of course, blogger Pete North. Thanks so much for doing the show, Pete.
Hello.
And you said just go with blogger as your description, but I was going to say writer and commentator. You're many things. And you sort of keep getting binned off Twitter, don't you? And you keep coming back. Sometimes you're Pete North, other times you're Northern Variant.
Can't keep a good man down.
Can't keep a good man down, exactly. And what I wanted to ask you straight away was, you listened to my episode, or watched my episode with Ben Habib of Reform UK, and you had a bit of a critique of it. And it's going to get a bit meta and self-indulgent, but I think it is of wider interest. So what was your critique of what Ben was saying and your wider critique of Reform UK?
Okay, well, first off, I do have a lot of respect for Ben, because he's someone who, he doesn't actually want to be in politics, but he's got this compulsion. And if you meet him, the one thing that's not in doubt is his absolute conviction. And actually, nobody else would take a niche issue like the Northern Ireland. For mainstream politics, it's a niche issue, and he's pursuing it, and from a very principled point of view, and you have to respect that. But reform, I'm someone who's politically homeless, and there is nothing I would like more than to say that's the alternative. They're brilliant, and sink my energies into promoting something. But I've been looking at all the disparate factions of the right, and there's, Goodwin and Cummings making noises about starting something new, but we don't know what that is. Then there's sort of a gaggle of nativist, sort of not quite far right parties, but heading in that direction. And so the one obvious contender is reform. And I'm thinking, putting it bluntly, it's everything about it is amateurish, and it's a populist party in that you look at its manifesto. There's no philosophical thread through any of its policies. And if you look at any of the other sort of minnow parties, their websites at least have a definition of what we stand for, our principles, our philosophy, what we're about, why we exist, be it sort of national conservatism or UKIP's national democracy. There's a foundational idea. And of course, anything that grows up from the wreckage of the Tory party will probably form upon national conservatism, which is a fully codified ideology that they're going to basically import from the US equivalent, give or take the section on God and religion. So you're left with reform, and I'm looking, it's obvious that there's substance and ideology driving Ben Habib, but there's, look at the reform website, and it's just a few introductory blurbs from Richard Tyson. Why does this exist? What does it want to achieve? What is its strategy, and what would it do in power? And you look at all of these blurbs that pass as policies, and they look like they've been plucked out of a tombola. And most of them are contradictory, and they're dealing with symptoms. And what I've put to reform is that a party calling itself reform should have a reform agenda, something big, something ambitious, because everybody is, on the dissident right is agreed that not only are the establishment parties no good, that something fundamental has to change about the way we're governed. We've had a procession of unelected prime ministers. We've got these deadbeat parties. We've got the blob that seems to be in control no matter who is in power. We've got a Westminster and Whitehall establishment that believes servicing the international rules-based order and being a good global citizen is the very definition of being of acting in the national interest. These people have no concept of the national interest. And so we've got a foreign policy that's geared to delivering the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And this is what Cameron's promoting overseas and becoming a climate leader on the world stage. And this is not what people want. People want a government and a system that will put where their votes mean something, where they have a real choice, where the policies actually get delivered, and they're delivered in the name of the people. So I've put it to reform that we need to be thinking along the lines of a great restoration bill as their sort of single issue, to push for that, to withdraw from the UN, to pull out of the Paris Agreement, to dump the Northern Ireland Protocol and the TCA if necessary, the ECHR, just dump it, to and then a people's sovereignty bill. Because I don't know if you saw, there was this new culture forum thing with Dr. David Starkey giving one of his lectures about the restoration of Parliament and parliamentary sovereignty. His thesis is that we've found Brexit is such a disappointment because all the power has been distributed in international courts and conventions like the Refugee Convention and Quangos, and the sovereignty of Parliament has been undermined. And he says that's why we're not able to make good on Brexit. So we need to restore parliamentary sovereignty. I'm thinking, wait just a second, because who did all this to us in the first place? Who signed us up to Maastricht and Lisbon without a referendum? How did we end up enmeshed in ECHR and net zero? And Parliament did all these things to us because there's no constraints on what they can do to us between elections. A general election is a very poor mechanism of holding them to account. Then there's the inherent payroll vote, where anyone who wants to be a minister or is a minister or a PPS or whatever, they have to vote for the government. So you don't get a parliament that holds government to account. So, we need a constitutional overhaul. Basically, no powers can be divested into international treaties without a referendum. Nothing that incurs penalties like ULEZ can happen without a referendum, where people actually have a genuine say. And all of these democratic rights based around the people's sovereignty, you put that in, I wouldn't say an American-style constitution, but you have to put something in law that says these people cannot give our powers away or cannot bind future governments to these arbitrary virtue signaling targets without the people's consent, because that's the thing that's been missing. So if you explore all of these issues, there is massive scope for rethinking the culture of government and the structure of government and the structure of our democracy. Yeah, you go on the Reform website and you drill down into what does it say about reforming our democracy? Oh, proportional representation, because that's the one thing that's just in popular circulation without even thinking, would that actually achieve anything? Because, people talk about PR like it's the answer. Well, it's not governmental reform. It's electoral reform. And we could do that, and maybe it would give us a more representative selection of politicians. but you still end up with 650 MPs. And that's a problem because they're coming from all over the country and they have to be down here quite a lot of the time. So we give them a housing allowance. So they're spending half of their time living here. And who's their social circle? Think tankers, television producers, other MPs, lords, all this sort of political Westminster bubble. And, you know, if I wanted to be an MP, right now, I wouldn't join any of these little parties. I would just calibrate my beliefs according to the one that was most likely to win. So this time around, I might reinvent myself as, I've been a socialist all along, so I'm going to join the Labour Party, get myself selected, subordinate my own ideas, toe the party line. So, you know, people who are ambitious enough to become MPs tend to be these conformist, narcissistic sociopaths. And you're going to basically take 650 narcissistic sociopaths, put them in one room and give them unlimited power for 5 years to make decisions on our behalf. If we were designing a system of government from scratch and you suggested this, you would think they were lunatics. So, you know, I want to see a ambitious reform party with a big agenda, ambitious ideas that drive. Because you know the UKIP was a movement. A lot of people say that Nigel Farage carried it to an extent, but it was built up over 20 years at little branch meetings in church halls in places like Thirsk, Morecambe, Salisbury, little village pubs, and sometimes it would be Alan Sked and Nigel Farage driving out to these far-flung places to speak to a church hall meeting, and there'd be three guys in colonial blazers and a farting Labrador, and the tea lady who's come to lock up after it's finished, and she would be polite enough to sit in and listen. So it was word of mouth that was built up around this single idea of restoring British sovereignty and leaving the EU. It had there was a movement, a philosophy, and a purpose, and that's how it grew. Whereas you had the sort of transposition from the Brexit Party to Reform, and it believes it is the natural inheritor of that movement and that it can take it for granted. Well, if you look at the Blackpool South by-election results, Reform isn't the beneficiary of disaffected votes, and it's certainly not where the disaffected Tories are going. Blackpool South should be a stronghold because it's one of the left behind places. And if you've got a good ground game, it's quite easy to mount a ground campaign because it's high density terraced houses in a place that's been forgotten. That should have been quite a hefty, comfortable second place for Reform. And it scratched third place with Labour winning with 2,000 less votes than it got the last time around. So there's no enthusiasm for Labour, and something like 11,000 Tory voters staying at home. So we're seeing the right-inclined voters just quitting from politics. And Reform should be there. Reform should be the one hoovering up these votes and powering through, growing a movement with an agenda that people can believe in and with authenticity. And it's that authenticity that's missing because it doesn't really serve a function. It doesn't know why it exists. So I'd like to be in a position where I didn't have to criticize Reform, but I think unless it gets its act together and soon and starts doing the actions necessary to build a ground game from the bottom up and to with a 20-year plan for power and build something, I think it's going to end up being a bed blocker that just exists and soaks up a lot of media attention, soaks up enough votes to stay in business, but not enough to break through, certainly not enough to punch through the populist cul-de-sac. And so it's not going to take us anywhere. And then the moment something, say, if Cummings or Goodwin or the wreckage of the Tory party reforms as a national Conservative, that will be new shiny thing, and so that's what the media will focus on, and that's where the voters will gradually go back, and reform will be stood there going, oh, what do we do now? And then it will just fade into the background and cease to exist, probably. So I think it's got an existential crisis that it needs to address quite soon.
All right. Well, the one bit you may not have seen of the interview was the sort of the paid Substack questions, obviously. And in those, Ben Habib did say, yes, we need a membership structure. Because people asked questions from my Substack, and they said, nickdixon.net, and they said things like, UKIP had this membership structure and all these meetings and so on. Is Reform going to get that? And Ben said, yeah, they will get that. It's just a question of, they're new, it's resources, but they definitely will get that. So there's a sort of an understanding they need some of that. But I do take a lot of your critiques on board there. I watched the Starkey speech you referred to with the New Culture Forum. Hero of mine, David Starkey, were both born in Kendal, and I met him recently, and we had a good chat about that. So he's a great man, but I did understand your critique of it, which was that we didn't do this, Parliament did it, so you're talking as if we can undo this, but we can't. Or even if we could, they could simply reverse that again.
Yeah, there's nothing whatsoever stopping them doing all this to us again.
Yes.
So long as the executive has unchecked powers on the kind of trade deals it can sign, there was a time, sort of 30 years ago, when a free trade deal was, just a list of tariffs that you're going to eliminate. But it's developed into this comprehensive treaty system where there's chapters on everything from vehicle standards to climate measures, environment measures. And there's the EU model that we've had with FTAs with half the world. We've transposed that model because it's based on the WTO FTA model, and lots of different countries use it. But these are the ways in which policy and standards get embodied in international treaties. So that we increasingly find when we want responsive government, we want to change a piece of regulation or a piece of legislation, we have to inform the other party first, and we've got to weigh up whether it's going to affect our trade or not. So trade and frictionless trade is taking priority over whether regulations are fit for purpose and whether they actually work. So there's all these different mechanisms by which government can farm out the people's sovereignty.
Yeah.
And there's no supervision, and there's no corrective mechanism, and there's no system of consent.
It's a quangocracy that we've heard about that's going to get worse on the start.
Yeah. And you look at a lot of people have been coming to me saying, would a Swiss system of direct democracy? And I'm saying absolutely yes, not just on a national level on contentious issues, but if you take things like ULEZ and low traffic neighborhoods and all the measures around 15-minute cities, all the sorts of little stuff that people have a bugbear about. None of these things would have ever been done if they'd have actually had to ask consent, permission from the people to do. If they'd have had a London-wide referendum on ULEZ, would it have passed? No chance. Absolutely no way.
Right.
So, this is what we want. We want the people's consent at the heart of governmental decision making.
So is that the solution? Because when I listen to your critique of Starkey, I end up thinking of elite theory. And I don't know how much you know about that. I've got a cursory understanding from people like Dr. Nima Parvini. And basically, elite theory suggests that there's not that much we can do, that an organized minority always wins over the disorganized majority. And the power of the people is an illusion. No one overthrows anyone in history. Simply a new elite comes in and supplants the old elite. And as I was listening to your critique, or reading your critique of Starkey on X, I was thinking, this is similar to that. It's you're sort of saying it's Parliament that did this. The people were never involved in this. And therefore, my question is, how can the people solve any of the things you mentioned? Is it therefore, you've just sort of maybe gone ahead and said it, which is direct democracy. Is that the only way? I mean, if Reform suggested this massive bill, this Reformation bill you're talking about, of let's leave the ECHR, is it just leaving all these bodies that take power out of the people? Is it a massive kind of post-Brexit, okay, we've left the EU, but now we need to leave the ECHR and all the other things you listed? Or is it just a case of as sort of lame, as sort of the average person, can all we do is wait till the new elite somehow wrestles power, whether it's the Dominic Cummings elite, whether it's sort of an Elon Musk, Javier Milei thing in America linked with Trump, which some people have posited. Do we just wait for some slightly more sympathetic elite to take power? What do we actually do?
Well, the reason I centre on these things, you look at the ECHR, it should be pretty obvious now that we're not going to get a grip on the immigration crisis without taking legal activism out of the equation. But you're looking at a country that is not managing to build anything. We're not building new reservoirs, we're not building new power stations, and we're not building new infrastructure like tunnels and railways.
Yeah.
And we're finding that every ambitious project we want to do, there's 10 years of planning where you've got your carbon counting and your and all your green assessments. And yeah, we want to look after the environment. Yeah, we want construction to be done in a courteous and sympathetic way. But when you're actually having to hire armies of carbon accountants and plot these carbon plans over 20 years, there's little wonder that nothing ever gets built. And you spend, there was I think that Thames Tunnel, they've spent over 350 million, and they're nowhere near to even starting it, I think. So that's just on planning alone. So all of this is a derivative of the sort of carbon trading that's locked in all the international treaties, the drive to net zero. That's not something that just arrived in Parliament. That is a direct obligation under the Paris Agreement, or moves in that direction. And it goes to what I was saying about the culture of government. It's focused on delivering international treaties and global agendas rather than the direct national interest. And so long as these things are in place, they've got the excuse to not do these things. They've got the excuse to not deregulate. They've got the excuse to not build things and say, so we've got this baked-in agenda that we can do nothing about. And so as much as it's necessary precursor to reforming the country, it's also a huge symbolic gesture to put the national interest and national democracy at the centre of government, to refocus the establishment. And so I think this is the kind of reform that we have to make to change the culture of government. That's the key thing, the mindset. Who is this Westminster establishment serving? Does it exist to implement these global agendas, or does it exist to serve us? And we need a sort of system of reforms that reminds them who they work for. That's
right. But where does the pressure come on them to do that? Because, as you say, voting is very limited. We can vote infrequently. The candidates are sort of pre-selected, of course, and then we may not like any of them. And with first past the post, your vote may be irrelevant. Mine will certainly be irrelevant because Labour will win a massive landslide in my area. So how do we even pressure the government into recognising that they seems to me they do need the tacit consent, as it's been put to me, of the people, but that things have to go very wrong for them to lose that and for that to really impact upon them. It has to get, maybe it's a poll tax situation, maybe there are these moments, maybe Brexit was one of these moments, but how do we reach a point where it's so damaging to them that they have to respond to the people? Because otherwise, it seems they will just continue to ignore things. They've ignored. I mean, the classic example being the Tories bringing in more people than we've ever seen in, like, practically the whole history of Britain. There was some stat the other day; it was more people than between 1066 and 2022 or something in like 2 years or something insane. There's some insane figures like that. They brought in catastrophic amounts of people. So you say, okay, these people are compared to completely ignore the so-called will of the people. So how do you even get them to care about that?
Well, there's one crunch point that's coming, which is the collapse of the automotive industry, because of this drive for EVs. Right. That's one of those things where it's going to come to a crunch, and the government is going to have to reverse the EV incentives and the end of the petrol car. Now, this is the sort of measure that should have been put to a referendum to begin with. This is so far-reaching that we should never have allowed politicians to take us to this point in the first place. So if you look at where all these crunch points are happening, it's because a decision was taken, a stupid decision and an unpopular decision that was imposed on the people without consent. And so there has to be a system of I don't know, we'd have to work out some kind of criteria, but certainly anything with such massive cost implications for householders, people have got to be given a say. And if the people have a say, then chances are we avoid getting in these messes to begin with. That's how I feel about it.
Okay, and just when you were speaking there, I was thinking about referendums. Reform have hinted at a referendum on net zero. There was even an article about the Tories. If the Tories did a referendum on immigration, they could win back in this, according to this poll, it was something like 41% of reform voters or something, some quite large percentage. I was 60% or something. I was quite surprised. I was thinking these people have been promising to get immigration to the tens of thousands since 2010 with David Cameron and again with Theresa May, and they never do it. So I wouldn't even believe them. But perhaps if they held a referendum on it, that would force them to do it and give them the impetus to do it. Is that what we need then? Just referendums on all these key issues?
Not so much immigration, because if you look at the Brexit referendum, there was something that the referendum was bound to, Article 50. If it goes one way, you've got to submit Article 50 and get on with it, get on with the process of leaving. But if you have a referendum on immigration, what does it bind the government to do? Set a new target. Well, we've had them setting targets before. And what we're finding is that they couldn't actually reach these targets even if they wanted to, even if there was the political will, because there's all of these barriers. There's the ECHR. You've got a dysfunctional civil service. Yeah. You've got
even the private sector. The people running the planes said they wouldn't take off for Rwanda.
Yeah, you got a civilian border force that goes on strike the moment it's actually asked to enforce the borders. So it's I'm not talking. It would be impractical to sort of drop everything and have referendums every 5 minutes, but I'm talking about restoring the concept of people's consent. Not everything can be put to popular vote, but certainly the treaties that kick off all of this stuff, these are the things that require the people's consent. So that's a slightly different strand. The rest of it's a question of changing the culture of government and changing the idea of what it serves. I mean, you look at foreign aid, for instance. A lot of populist parties will say, "Oh, we're going to scrap foreign aid," and I'm thinking, well, your foreign policy still is going to need financing. And so you look at what's being spent on, what foreign aid money is being spent on, and you find that's most of it is waste or things that are not going to work. And it's not that the foreign aid budget exists, it's the mindset behind the people who are doing the spending. So there's going to have to be a complete clear out. There's going to be a redesign, but again, it comes down to mentality. You have at the FCDO a bunch of academics and blobbers and people from the charitable sector and philanthropic foundations who believe the national interest is enforcing the global rules-based order and implementing those sustainable development goals. They just don't see that their job is to promote Britain's interest. They believe being a global citizen is in the national interest, and so that's the mindset. So you need nationally focused policies, but as much as anything, it's about the culture of government.
Okay, and speaking of immigration, then if it's not a referendum on that, what is your specific solution for immigration? Because I read your piece on X about how you're a civic nationalist, but you also recognize that things have gone very far with immigration. Yes. So you're thinking, okay, what do we need to do at this point? So what is it? Because this idea of sending, deporting loads of people, sending them back, just doesn't seem realistic. And yet we have these massive numbers. Even the reform policy of so-called net zero immigration, which is Tice's kind of buzzword, that would still potentially mean 600,000 people coming in because, it depends on how many emigrate. But I know that Ben Habib doesn't use that term, and he's not keen on that because he thinks that's not enough because you could still have 600,000 people coming in then. So what is your solution that's realistic for immigration at this point?
Well, I've brought this up with Reform. They need to drop this net zero because this net zero immigration slogan. But this is the broader problem with populist slogans. The moment you apply the slightest bit of scrutiny to them, a lot of them just fall over. And as you say, net zero immigration is 400 to 600,000 influx every year. That's still crazy. That mass immigration. And so, last week we had the Generics, is it CPS think tank report that comes up with all these clever measures. Yeah. All right, this is good stuff. But it's all shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. You still have a huge problem with garbage immigration. We have a welfare system that is paying the least productive citizens to do absolutely nothing in prime real estate in London. And one thing that is the primary cause of instability and civil strife is where you have a surplus of low IQ, unemployed men who are not. We're never going to be able to integrate them, and so we need policies to deal with garbage immigration. And so, I don't think we're culturally or temperamentally likely to send out armies of deportation vans. But one thing that's clear is we cannot afford the levels of welfare spending. There is going to have to be a rethink about who can qualify. Why are we paying foreigners? Why are we paying people to live in London to do nothing? Why are we paying absolutely crazy sums in housing benefit? We spend tens of billions. And so we're going to have to rethink welfare. We're going to have to rethink a lot of social policies and set boundaries and say, the kind of behaviors that we're seeing, we're not going to put up with it. And we need a new civic contract where if you break that civic contract, you're out, and so is your family, so your dependents. We need to be far more aggressive about what we'll accept. We need policies, effectively the hostile environment policies, to incentivize departure. If people cannot sustain themselves through regularized work, they don't belong here and they should be encouraged to go. And I think looking at the long-term costs, I think even if we offered them up to £7,000 as a cash incentive to leave, it would be a long-term saving. So I do think we're, parties like Reform, if you look at their immigration policy, they're going to find a lot of voters find that that's a little bit weak. It doesn't go near far enough because sentiment is moving further and further to the right on immigration all the time. And I look at where I am and the things I'm tweeting recently, and the Pete North from 10 years ago would be a little bit... Yeah, that's a bit rich for my blood. But
reading your own tweets.
but you look at what's happening across Europe. People who simply will never integrate. And now that we've had the Gaza situation kicking off, we're starting to see these foreign conflicts erupting on our own streets. And last year we had Hindu nationalists versus Muslims on the streets of Leicester. We've got powder kegs in every city. And if for instance, India goes to war with Pakistan, oh my God, have we got a serious problem. And there's all of these. We see it on, all places around London. We've got a government, an establishment that's paranoid about the rise of the far right and this backlash against ethnic minorities. Well, actually, we're all just going to be sat going, just powerless as the ethnic minorities set on each other, and we're going to lose our cities. And this is because we've got this surplus of unemployable, useless people that can't integrate, never going to, don't belong here, and so we need to be incentivizing these people to leave quickly.
All right, and do you see, I mean, some people think that's controversial, but as you say, I mean, you've started out as a moderate and you're just sort of observing where it's gone. I mean, the complete failure to deal with immigration has made people seem more extreme. They're not, English people aren't extreme, but they've been made to seem that way in the face of the real extremism, one could argue, which is the numbers of people coming in, which is sort of unprecedented. But on this, do you see any hope from Europe then? Because I just happen to have this piece here because we covered it last night on GB News, which is about Geert Wilders and his coalition government that's now sort of sorting themselves out. And they're having some quite tough rhetoric on the new asylum policies and these kind of things that you're talking about, where we're incentivizing people not to work. They're going to have abolished asylum permits. They're going to people with refugee status will no longer be given priority when allocating social housing. People without proper papers will be deported as soon as possible, including forcibly. Farmers won't have to meet these nitrogen emissions anymore. So this is the kind of stuff you're talking about. Is there any hope in Europe that this kind of thing is now happening?
I'll believe it when I see it, because anyone can come out with the rhetoric. We heard all this from Maloney. She was going to sort immigration out, and then the first thing she does is go, we've got a labour shortage, we need more immigrants. So there's a disconnect between what they say on the way to power and what they do when they get it. And this is why I don't believe proportional representation is necessarily an answer, because these people have all come to power through PR, and then they get the coalition governments, and then the moment their policy gets a little bit too spicy, one of their coalition partners will pull out and collapse the government. And that could happen in under 6 months, in under 3 months. And then you've also got a huge disconnect between the politics and the people are sharply divided. So you're going to find leftist crowds coming out to try and stop deportations in their masses. You're going to see counter demonstrations. So the likelihood of half of these these policies being implemented is slim. So I think it's going to have to get worse before it gets better, before there's a clear mandate. At the minute, he's got a very fragile mandate to operate, and it could just as easily evaporate. And I think it's going to be much slower in the UK. We're slower to catch on. We will get there eventually. I think what's different about the continent is that if you look at the sort of anti-immigrant right in the UK, the leading voices tend to be men of a certain age, and they're the people raising the alarm, and everybody's just saying, yeah, no, it's not an issue. But on the continent, you're seeing more and more women rising to prominence because they are realizing the kind of third world immigration that's coming from the sort of Arab areas and third world Africa. It is a direct threat to their safety. And we're now starting to see a new discourse about demographic anxieties, about becoming the minorities in our own country and losing the basics of civilization. A high trust society, and a society that understands the relevance of not defecating in the street, that understand the concept of public litter bins. These are the things that make. The difference is we have a concept of the public sphere and the public good. That doesn't occur in third worldism. And once third worldism becomes the dominant street level philosophy, if you like, we've lost civilization, and we're going to have to fight for it. And we're going to have, and because we're so sharply divided, we're going to end up fighting each other as much as we're going to end up fighting with migrants. And I think unless we establish robust policies to hold the line, and I think we're already losing, then I think we're going to see Europe in flames again, because you've got a European establishment that is all set for gearing up for war with Russia, but establishments that are effectively undermining their own national security, undermining their own people. Who's going to fight for these people? Who's going to say, I'm going to fight for David Cameron and Rishi Sunak. I'm going to fight Russia. No, because I'm going to be coming home to what? A ruined country that's no longer my own, where the Muslim bloc vote has more power, where there's blasphemy laws, you name it. This is where it could go. So I think we're at a critical juncture. And so, we're going to need far more robust policies. And I don't think the Tory party isn't ready. The centre-right is non-existent. If you want anything between Tories and the so-called far right, what is there? There's Reform sat there with its half-baked net zero immigration policy and no repatriation agenda, nothing like that. And you've got Tice, who's running scared of hope, not hate. So is he going to come out with any robust policies and go on television and robustly defend them? I'm not sure. I'd like to think so, but I'm still waiting on something I can hand on heart say, yep, that's what I'm going to vote for because that's what's needed. But right now, doesn't exist. I have nowhere I can put my vote.
Yeah, and I was just thinking there when you were talking about it was almost a contradiction between our sort of overconfidence that people can integrate and will understand fairly English concepts like fair play and all these things and free speech and civil liberties that are by no means universal, it turns out. So there's an overconfidence that people will just integrate into that. At the same time, there's a complete lack of confidence in what our values are. And as you say, a complete lack of kind of patriotism, whereby we saw, for example, that absurd document that leaked that was given out to army higher-ups that said things, indicators of far-right behavior, and one of them was patriotism, and this was the army.
Yes.
So you're going, why would I sign up for that? And there was talk of conscription recently, and many of us were just thinking, why would I sign up, even if I was the right age, even if I love my country, because these people despise me and despise the country.
And you've got foreigners that wouldn't fight for us either.
They wouldn't fight either.
Croydon High Street. Would you sign up for the British Army to fight Russia? No.
God, no.
Because I'm not British.
Yeah. They explicitly hate the country. The left hates the country.
Yeah.
Immigrants who are not integrated hate the country. And then the people that actually like the country are hated by the establishment and by the military.
Yes.
And useless white males in the RAF was another quote.
Yeah. So there's no agreed set of values. I'm sure we could, if there was a national debate, arrive on what we do actually stand for. But as it stands, there's so much division. There's so much cultural division between the country and the capital, and between the countryside and the cities. Because the cities, we've pretty much lost Birmingham, we've pretty much lost parts of London. They don't respond in the same way. Different values. You're finding ethnic bloc votes have much more power, so they're not representative, and so we've got competing sectarianism basically. And how I don't even know how you begin to glue all that back together.
Yeah,
and only time and policies to sort of integrate and reunify the country are going to do it, but it's going to take a generation and it's going to take discipline. But one thing that we can't go on with is this continued multiculturalism. Anything goes. You just be you, and you bring your third world customs, and we'll salute that and say that's fine that you're different. No, we can't exist like that.
All right, that is the end of the free episode. But if you want the full podcast, go to nickdixon.net for all the extra content, all my articles. That is my Substack, nickdixon.net. And we need your help to keep this whole thing going, keep the lights on, this amazing production, hiring people, etc. nickdixon.net to support us. It's £5 a month, which is about the cost of some sort of fancy latte in London, or there's a slight discount if you get the yearly option, or it's just £5 a month. So we'll see you on nickdixon.net, and thank you very much.